My name is Xavier Pye and I'm a Sustainable Associate at CorreggioNET. And in today's Correggio Academy session, I'm going to be providing an overview of the voluntary carbon market. To speak a bit about my background, I've spent a number of years working for ACX, which was the first fully regulated carbon exchange based out of Abu Dhabi's global markets. And there I got a very comprehensive view of the market actors, how the market functions, and I look forward to sharing these insights with you today. Now you're going to have to bear with me. We're going to cover quite a lot in this session. Everything from the core fundamentals of the carbon market to its evolution over the years, starting with the carbon credit itself, how it functions in practice, what are the core characteristics of a carbon credit, and how they appear on the registries, to making the distinction between the voluntary and compliance carbon markets, for then talking a bit about the evolution of international frameworks, which again promote this compliance element, namely Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as well as the CORSIA framework for international aviation, before moving on to some of the key actors in the space, namely the governance bodies and exchange platforms, and then providing an overview of the markets over the years, a kind of deep dive into the history and some of the successes and missteps within the market, before finally hypothesizing on where the market could go and what companies could be doing right now. So what is a carbon credit? A carbon credit represents a ton of carbon dioxide emissions that have been avoided, i.e. prevented from entering the atmosphere, or a ton of carbon dioxide that has been removed, i.e. taken out of the atmosphere for a period of time. Now, a carbon credit has two statuses, issued and retired. Issuance takes place after the emission reduction or removal has taken place and is done by the registries, the carbon registries. And it's usually the case that a carbon credit can remain in its issued state in perpetuity, allowing it to change hands and ownership multiple times. However, the offset can only be claimed at the point of retirement, and this is a singular event that only happens once for every carbon credit, and it's usually done to offset a firm's unavoidable carbon emissions. And it's an important function of the registries to track the retirement of carbon credits, because this is how you prevent, say, double counting, whereby a carbon credit is used for 2 tons of carbon emissions rather than the 1 ton that it represents a reduction for, or an offset for. Now, there are 2 distinct carbon markets in existence today. There's the voluntary market and the compliance market, and there's a rather large divide between them. At its core, you can look at the differences between the unit itself. So in the compliance carbon market, particularly under, say, an emissions trading scheme like the EU's, which is a cap and trade regime, there the unit is an allowance, and each allowance permits the user to pollute 1 ton of carbon emissions. And so they must purchase a number of allowances equal to their emissions. And it is the government that issues these permits to pollute effectively. And in every year, they will reduce the number of these units available, thereby driving up the price and encouraging companies to decarbonize their emissions. And in theory, in line with EU targets, that this will reach, there'll be 0 allowances in the future, or there'll be removal backed in order for the EU to become net zero. But again, at its core, the allowance or the unit is a permit to pollute, and it isn't backed by anything, with the exception of the legislative framework that compels these organizations to interact with this market, as well as the government itself controlling the issuance of these units. The voluntary market, on the other hand, doesn't have this enforcement mechanism compelling firms to participate. And so any firm looking to interact in the market, in a sense, has to buy the good work of another firm who has made those investments to generate the carbon reductions or removal credits. And so, in effect, every carbon credit in the voluntary market is asset backed by a project somewhere in the world that is doing that emission reduction. And this is where a lot of the complication comes into this market, because there's a variety of different project types that can, again, generate carbon credits, different methodologies and scientific ways of calculating the emission reduction, not to mention the jurisdictions in which these carbon projects operate. And each one provides companies a choice as to what they're looking for and allows them to be quite picky as to what carbon credits they would like to purchase. But also, in addition to this, the project-specific nature of the voluntary carbon market opens up these firms to reputational risk, whereas in a compliance scheme where the government has outlined what carbon credits are deemed eligible or ineligible, in the voluntary market it is completely down to the corporate in question to make that purchasing decision and to decide on which carbon project or carbon credit to purchase. And that opens them up to reputational risk. For example, if the project in question were to be found to be miscalculating the number of offsets, say over-generating, which is a big faux pas in the market, or if there is potentially a unforeseen loss event, again, for example, a forest burning down, which is totally out of their control, they might get some negative headlines and press from that, which again adds to this unwillingness for corporates to make big moves in this market. And again, ultimately, it's voluntary, and corporates don't have to engage in this market if they feel it's more hassle to do so than not. And last but not least, this project-specific nature of the units also makes standardization in this market quite difficult because of all the methodological and taxonomies of these different project types, which we'll touch upon subsequently. So this is what I like to call the carbon markets, or the voluntary carbon markets taxonomy of complexity. These are the key ones, at least for deriving a carbon credits eligibility for compliance schemes, but also these are the main markers that the market looks to when trying to price a given carbon credit. Now, starting on, we have the carbon registries. In a sense, for each carbon credit, every carbon credit is issued on a registry and by and large never leaves the registry it is issued on. And they are essentially the key gatekeepers in the carbon market for determining whether a project should be issued a carbon credit. They verify they review the documentation submitted by a given carbon project to assess and ascertain how many carbon credits should be issued. And they crucially hold the database which determine who owns all the carbon credits and who the holders of the carbon credits at any given time, and the reconciliation between a carbon credit issuance and retirement, and making sure that no double retirements of any particular carbon unit or carbon credit, I should say, can take place. They have a very important foundational or bedrock, or provide the bedrock foundations for the voluntary carbon markets. Without them, carbon credits simply wouldn't exist. After the registries, we have the methodologies, and the methodologies are the scientific underpinnings for a given carbon project, and they are the means by which a registry will ascertain how many carbon credits can be produced by a given project. Oftentimes, the methodologies might be specific to certain registries, and when we have the registry, oftentimes they will have a separate body, which is the standard, separate from the registry itself, which are the governance council and the scientific body that amends these methodologies at times and proposes new methodologies for new emission reduction types. Before engaging in developing a project developer will have to decide which methodology to choose that is most pertinent to their type of project. Where the methodology doesn't exist, then that project developer will need to propose that methodology with the standards body of the registry in order for that to be adopted, and then from there for carbon credits to be generated from that methodology. But this is a quite an expensive proposition, and it can take a number of years for a methodology to be reviewed, to have the public feedback element to it, and for it to be adopted by a given registry. The concept of additionality is a key piece of the voluntary carbon market and is tightly woven into the methodological underpinnings for any given project. Put simply, additionality is the measure by which would a carbon credit have been or an emission reduction have taken place if a carbon credit hadn't been generated in the process to assist with the development of, say, that project and make it more financially viable. To give you a real-world example, a perfect example of this would be renewable energy. So renewable energy-based carbon credits have been one of the biggest contributors to the voluntary carbon market historically. Renewable energy projects have done tremendously well in terms of being financed by carbon credits, and I think they still represent a majority of emission reductions issued to date. However, that being said, it is now no longer possible to register, say, large-scale, utility-scale solar and wind plants for carbon credits because they're no longer deemed additional. This is because that oftentimes renewable energy is by far the cheapest option for energy generation, and outside of those least developed countries. And so this is a perfect use case of a project or a project type that was once additional, transitioning away from and becoming non-additional with the success of that technology. And it really speaks to the power the carbon market has in gestating new project types and new technologies for emission reduction. That being said, new projects might not be able to be registered with registries today. However, existing projects that are already on the registry are already can maintain issuing their credits up until the point of the project is complete, at least on the registry. And as a result, many companies have decided against the use of voluntary carbon credits from these project types. Next, we have the project. As mentioned previously, every single carbon credit in the voluntary market will originate from a specific project based somewhere around the world. And again, there are additional criteria associated with this. For example, the country where the project is based, the project developer who actually instigated the project, and again, their reputation in the market, various other factors. But again, we'll probably skip over this one because I will cover it in more detail once we do a deep dive into what the actual registry infrastructure looks like. Next, we have the co-benefits and ratings. Now, beginning with the co-benefits, in addition to a project's carbon avoidance or removal, a project may also wish to tackle other issues, more often than not related to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For example, providing clean water or educational provision within the project's boundaries. The reason for this is that oftentimes a project that has these additional co-benefits can charge a higher price by virtue of the fact that their project is deemed more marketable. You know, it's achieving more than just a pure emission reduction. It's providing all these additional corporate social kind of responsibilities, which makes them far more desirable to those corporates looking to meet their ESG goals. And oftentimes these co-benefits themselves will come with their own application and verification requirements. So you're not just taking the project developer's word for it. This provides, it increases actually quite a lot of the expense involved for these project developers in order to get their projects and their co-benefits attributed and everything. Outside of co-benefits, we also have the carbon rating agencies, and these have really been developed over the last 5 years. We've seen a number of them come into being, and their key purpose is to assuage many of the corporate's concerns over the reputational risks associated with the project. Oftentimes they will be providing additional certification or review of a given project additionality. Also quite often they are more digitally savvy. For example, incorporating digital MRV or monitoring, reporting and verification through the use of satellites, for example. And this can make them more responsive than the registries when it comes to any happenings on the ground in many of these projects themselves. So many corporates like this because it gives them a bit of a heads up for any kind of reputational risk for a given project that they're looking to purchase or that they have within their carbon credits portfolio. Lastly, on our taxonomy, at least on the screen that you can see now, we have vintage. Now, vintage represents the year at which the carbon reduction or removal took place. The way at least the market interacts with vintage today is that there's often a premium for more recent vintages, i.e. reductions and removals that took place closer in time over older ones. So there's essentially a vintage depreciation curve for a given carbon credit. Now, there's a number of reasons why this has come to be the case. For instance, there are a number of project methodologies that have since been, say, discredited, and there's an awful lot of carbon credits from these methodologies that were from the early years of the carbon markets in, say, the early 2000s that are still kicking around the market. And so as a kind of good rule of thumb, older carbon credits could have this kind of risk of methodological error associated with them, because as I mentioned, again, once a carbon credit is issued, it remains in perpetuity more often than not. Another reason for this depreciation is also for compliance schemes. So oftentimes a compliance scheme will draw a line in the sand because, again, this large number of credits from the early years of the market. They will draw a line in the sand, after which credits can become eligible. So in the first phase of Corsair, the line or the year that they decided was 2016, and it was quite impressive. For the pilot phase, we saw, again, a 20% price differential between those credits that were issued before 2016 and those issued after 2016, even for the same project, credits from the same project, because suddenly those credits that were post 2016 were eligible under that Corsair scheme, at least the pilot phase. So that's another reason for this vintage depreciation. Now, that being said, there are certainly peculiarities with how the vintage depreciation works, because certainly I would be one to argue that for certain contexts, perhaps there should be an appreciation with age of a given carbon credit, particularly for those when it comes from project types that are forestry based, because an older carbon credit, you can see whether or not that carbon credit is, or the forest that it's associated with is still in good health and hasn't had any loss events, etc. But unfortunately, that's just me speaking, and is certainly not how the rest of the market generally sees it. Additional criteria that isn't mentioned on this presentation includes, say, crediting periods for a given project. And so essentially that is the period at which a project can be issuing carbon credits for. And these really differ based on the methodology and project type. But they can be anywhere from, say, 7 years at the lower end to upwards of 30 years for larger projects, particularly those for, again, reduced emissions from deforestation and afforestation efforts. Lastly, we have permanence, and permanence is the length of time a carbon removal or avoidance will persist for. So, for example, if you had a carbon removal direct air capture plant and the CO2 captured from that was pumped into geological storage, then you could be looking at a permanence of hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. Whereas a similar removal or another removal credit from an afforestation project, you're looking at a shorter permanence because it's based on the lifetime of, say, the forest and the trees that have been planted. So you're looking at, say, decades to maybe even a low century level. And so it's a bit more of a value judgment because, again, the science is really still developing on this as to how long carbon credits or carbon dioxide is locked up in these various project types. The reason it's important is because of the efficacy of, say, making that carbon credit claim. So if, for example, we were going to take a flight, when the kerosene is burnt in the plane's engines, that CO2 will remain in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years with natural, if we're just relying on, say, natural processes of reducing that from the atmosphere. And so using, say, a carbon credit from a project that is maybe, say, avoiding methane, is a methane avoidance project with a permanence of, say, 20 years or 25 years, because that's how long methane would last in the atmosphere for. Naturally, if nothing were done, it is quite, say, difficult to make a claim that your emissions have been removed permanently from the use of this project. Although, again, it's still better than taking no action. But this is really the crux of the issue, and why, especially with the governance bodies, this is quite a hot topic over removals or avoidance projects today, which can implement action much more quickly, but then don't have, say, that high permanence value. On the other hand, you have those other projects that are more, say, engineered removals, which certainly have a higher permanence factor, but then an incredibly high cost associated with them. So this is, again, a crucial key debate in the market today, and it really is a value judgment based on kind of the individuals and companies involved. But now, having covered all the theory, it's perhaps worth now looking at what a carbon credit looks like on the registry in practice. Now, it's worth noting that everything I'm showing you on the screen now is publicly available. You can just go and search, say, the Vera registry or Gold Standard, or whichever registry you choose, and freely view this information on the various carbon credits available on these platforms. That being said, certainly some registries are much more user-friendly than others. But as you can see here, we've entered in a search criteria and found a single project. In this case, it's a Delta Blue carbon project, and we can see all the key details. Its unique ID for that registry, obviously the name, the proponent. In this case, it's got multiple project developers that assisted in the creation of that project, so that's hence the name. Then you have the project type, its designation, the methodology, and then the status, which shows, is it registered and is it active, and then the country it's hosted on or hosted within, and then finally the estimated number of annual emission or carbon credits that could be produced by that project in a given year, and then the crucial dates as well, as to when it started, when the project was registered, and when it started crediting carbon credits. And for that last point, it's worth noting that oftentimes a project if a project begins registration, it might be able to issue credits from the date it first registered with the registry, because the registration process takes quite often a number of years. So they can still be financially viable by paying or by issuing those credits from the point that they started their registration process with the registry, as opposed to having to wait until the first, not only being registered, but getting the first year or few years under their belt in terms of production and emission reduction and avoidance. But once you so the top bar you have is the search bar on the, at least the Vera registry. And when you click on that, you can then go into the project specific page and see the project details in a fuller context. So as you can see, there's a description and a map showing the project, and on the right hand side you have all the additional or key project details, and notably as well the additional co-benefits. So in this case, the CCB certification and the level of certification they have in that regard. Below this, you have a number of PDFs that outline all the project documents, the project design documents, all the verification reports, because again, with every credit issuance, oftentimes the registries will mandate that an independent third party verify that the emission reductions took place, whether that be making a site visit or looking and reviewing the documentation on top of the review that the registry would make it themselves. So that's all available and publicly accessible on the registries for the carbon projects that are listed there. Moving on, we have the issuance database, and this is really where we see the actual carbon credits themselves. This database will have all the carbon credits that have been issued by that particular project, and a record of every time the carbon credit from that project has been retired, and it's all in a single table, at least in the case of Vera, the Verified Carbon Registry. And so on the screen here, you'll see an example of a retirement entry into the database. So we have, again, the key credit details, like the vintage, the issuance date, and then the project details. And then we can see here that in this case, 10,000 tons of carbon have been retired out of a total vintage quantity. So the year that those 10,000 were issued, there were 1.2 million tons created by that project. So again, quite a large carbon project in this case. And we can see who the retirement is on behalf of. So in this case, it is JP Morgan Chase Bank, and they're retiring on behalf of their own emissions. And the crucial thing here is the serial number. And in essence, this is what a carbon credit is. They've always been digital by nature, and it's this serial code that outlines the carbon credit. And at the bottom, we can see the PDF certificate that will also be sent to the retirement organization. And again, and crucially here, you can see that it also contains a serial number. Now, please note, this isn't the same certificate for this retirement entry, hence they're not the same. But again, in the case of, say, JP Morgan here, it would have the same serial number as you can see on the screen here. And obviously the name of the project involved, whereas this is a different one. But this is essentially what you get once you've made the environmental claim by retiring a carbon credit. That being said, so this is quite an interesting entry because it was made publicly. Another thing to note is that oftentimes, actually, I think they've crunched the numbers at over 60% of all retirements ever made for all carbon projects, at least on the major registries, have been done so anonymously. So this isn't great for transparency purposes, but it's completely understandable. whether it be because entities are using middlemen like brokers and requesting them retire the credits on their behalf, or it could be a case of companies wanting to protect themselves once again from those reputational risks. So for example, in this case of JP Morgan, their name is now associated with that project, and even if they decide never to purchase a carbon credit from that organization ever again, were there a loss event, no doubt a newspaper might drag their name up and say, in the past, JP Morgan has retired credits from this project, and thereby, again, create some reputational risk for the companies themselves. So that's one of the reasons why retirements have more often than not been made anonymously. That being said, there are new rules and regulations coming into place whereby even if the entry on the public database is anonymous, at least when it comes to the registries, they do have visibility on what organization the credits are being retired on behalf of, so they can actually see and track and record that, albeit not publicly. So this is essentially what a carbon credit is ultimately. Now, having gone through what a carbon credit is and into all the minutiae, it's time to roll it back a bit and to get back to the macro and bigger picture. And one of the key themes that we're seeing in the voluntary market going forwards is this merge between voluntary and compliance carbon markets. Now, there are already a number of different emissions trading schemes around the world, both at the national level, supranational in the case of the EU, national in the case of, say, the UK emissions trading scheme, and then the subnational in the case of regional efforts, for example, in California, the Californian emission trading scheme, and others in China and many of the regions there. And one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that in many of these, in actually it's 40% of these emissions trading schemes do allow for some form of offsets or domestic offsets to be used within their compliance regimes. And so this opens the door for these voluntary carbon credits to be used in these compliance schemes and provide a ready market for them, potentially offering higher prices as well, at least in the future once the prices of these emissions trading schemes increase. Now, it's worth noting that not all carbon credits will be eligible under these schemes. Oftentimes governments will offer or outline very strict eligibility criteria for which carbon credits would fall under and be eligible for their emissions trading scheme. Chief among these is usually that the carbon project itself must be situated within the boundaries of the emission trading scheme, or at least the national boundaries of the country in question. But that being said, there are moves towards making a broader market and a more homogenized market through policy developments, for example, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which I'll go into more detail, which enables the export of carbon credits and turns all carbon credits that have been authorized, at least by their host countries, into a form of a compliance instrument. And so here we're seeing some trailblazing countries, such as Singapore, allowing the use of foreign carbon credits within in their case it's a carbon tax, not an emissions trading scheme, but allowing international carbon units to be used to meet a portion of them. In the case of Singapore, I believe it's 5% of any firm that comes under the carbon tax can meet 5% of their carbon liabilities by using eligible carbon credits. And so the government in Singapore has outlined these criteria and has agreements with a number of countries for these international units to be used within their markets. And I believe governments are waking up to the opportunities that the voluntary carbon market has in, again, directing private finance, provided that the governments themselves develop and adopt the right eligibility criteria and the methodologies are sound. There's a tremendous value in leveraging the voluntary market within these carbon tax and emissions trading schemes to allow for that private investment in emission reduction across a broad swath of the economy, rather than is typically the case whereby the government either taxes or through the emissions trading scheme gathers all the revenue and then has to make those investment decisions themselves. Again, there are pros and cons to each. I mean, clearly governments need to make investments in a lot of macro scale infrastructure, but then for some of the, say, more distributed and small scale efforts, perhaps the voluntary market or allowing that private participation makes a lot of sense. For example, say rolling out EV charging points and the like. And so I think a lot of governments are waking up to this potential. Again, as mentioned, the development of the Article 6 framework of the Paris Accords is turbocharging this merge in between voluntary and compliance markets. The reason being is that when a carbon credit is authorized under the Paris Agreement, under that framework by a host country, so let's take a country in Africa authorizes a carbon credit generated from a cook stove or an afforestation project. What they are doing is they are foregoing that, receiving the emission reduction themselves and having that contribute to their own nationally determined contributions, and instead that unit can then be sold to a purchasing country, in this case let's say Switzerland, who will then get the benefits of that emission reduction, and they can be counted towards the purchasing country's nationally determined contribution. So there's a corresponding adjustment made to debit, say, the African country's account and credit the buying country's account. And this in effect creates or turns these voluntary carbon units into compliance-based units for use on the international stage. And this Article 6 framework, it provides an amazing tool for climate finance, because these countries are going to be receiving a hard currency in the form of the investment to produce these carbon credits. And not only this, but they'll also earn hard currency through the sale of the carbon units, all the while hopefully getting improved environmental outcomes within their own national boundaries. Because even though they will lose out on making the emission claim, they still get the secondary benefits. For example, if they say their transport fleet of public sector buses are all electrified, whilst the host country itself will not be able to make the claim or benefit from the emission reduction of that from their national kind of emissions level, they will still have all the net benefits of cleaner air and the secondary order effects from that environmental or carbon project. And so it perhaps represents one of the best exports a developing country can make. For the buying country, they obviously get the emission reduction, but they will also get it at a far more affordable price than perhaps were they to make the investment at home. You can use the analogy of, say, purchasing an electric car. For the price of an electric car, which would decarbonize, say, a family's emissions by a few tons, in Europe, say, that same investment, where it's spent in a less developed country, could electrify an entire, say, village, for the price of, say, $60,000 US or more. And so the emission reduction potential in that developing country, where they might be using, say, gas lamps, with the investment of a small microgrid, they might even be able to use that to cook and thereby reduce their emissions further. And so it illustrates that money spent abroad can quite often, with the purchasing power of a harder currency, lead to far greater emission reductions than is possible at home. And so in many ways, the carbon markets are a missing piece of the puzzle in terms of climate finance. As a result, there's a huge potential here for it to be a win-win for all sides. Now, the merge between voluntary and compliance markets is not a new phenomenon. In fact, one could argue that there's a tremendous sense of deja vu with all these developments. And I think the phrase, the name Back to the Future kind of sums it up nicely, because in many ways the market is reinventing many of the functions it had before, when there was a thriving carbon market back in the early 2000s under the original UN's Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. This mechanism was created under the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And the primary demand source for that market was the EU ETS, because actually in the early days of the EU ETS, they did allow these international units to be used within the emissions trading scheme. Once the rules became clear, actually you saw billions of dollars of investment around the world in the development of carbon projects that would supply and source credits for the EU emissions trading scheme. And corporates willingly participated in this market without any of the apprehension and the political risk involved with dealing with the voluntary carbon market today, because of the fact that the EU had determined the eligibility criteria of those carbon credits that could be used within its scheme. And so were a corporate accused of purchasing, say, project credits from a dubious project, they could quite easily point the green lobbyists, say, towards Brussels to lobby the politicians there to change the eligibility criteria. And in fact, this did happen There were instances of this happening. For example, with the HFC gas destruction methodologies, these were notorious for overissuing credits and having perverse incentives. And there was a lobbying effort to get these banned from the next stage of the EU ETS, and they were. And as soon as the Commission updated the eligibility requirements, corporates, funnily enough, stopped buying them. And this just demonstrates the power of creating clear and defined eligibility criteria for these schemes. And it also opens the door to standardizations in what is quite a complex market because of the different project origination of carbon credits. It enables some modcom of standardization to be had between project types. Even though things are moving on in the right direction and on the right trajectory for this merge between voluntary and compliance carbon markets, it's perhaps worth noting that, again, the majority of the market today is done on a voluntary basis. Now, despite its voluntary nature, over the years, numerous organizations have emerged to provide governance for the voluntary carbon market, each with a slightly different focus. From the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, which provides corporates with a framework for making environmental claims in line with the global climate targets, and other bodies such as ICROA, which are perhaps best well known in the industry for certifying and the voluntary carbon registries and standards and giving them a stamp of approval. These governance bodies often have hundreds of corporates members who look to these organizations for guidance. And I would go so as far as to argue that outside of government schemes where they're explicitly allowing for voluntary offsets within, say, compliance schemes, that these bodies have the most power in this market to drive demand. For example, the SBTI has over 10,000 members, and their collective emissions are well over 1.5 billion tons per year. Were even a fraction of this emissions profile permitted to use carbon offsets to address them, then this would represent a significant demand source for the voluntary carbon market. In fact, this has been an ongoing point of debate and contention within the SBTI and the broader market, between broader market participants, between those taking a more liberal stance on the use of carbon offsets for making their claims, and those who remain steadfast that all climate mitigation activities must materially go towards meeting climate targets. Again, particularly focusing on emission reduction within corporates themselves as opposed to using offsets. This is a vibrant topic and one that probably demands its own video itself, so I'll probably pause here on that subject. As you can see, I've also included the carbon trading platforms on this slide, and the reason for combining the two is because of the synergies between them. Namely, the standard setting that the governance bodies provide enable the exchanges and these trading platforms to develop more standardized products. Furthermore, oftentimes these trading platforms will provide clearer labeling that adhere to the labels that have been created from the governance bodies, and they can provide assurance that a given carbon credit is eligible towards a given scheme, for example, the core carbon principles under the ICVCM. And this really takes the pressure off corporates to do that due diligence themselves as to ascertaining whether a given carbon credit is eligible under any one of the various schemes. But it is worth noting, despite there being a variety of different carbon trading platforms and actually full-on exchanges, the majority of volumes taking place today are done, or trading taking place in the voluntary carbon market today is done on an over-the-counter basis, or OTC. And in fact, many of these exchanges are actually, a majority of their volumes are clearing these bilateral transactions between market participants as opposed to members of these exchanges trading, say, the standardized contracts. And again, I'll go into more detail in the subsequent slide as to why standardization and standardized contracts haven't really taken off outside of having futures products. In terms of the market history, as mentioned previously, the market got started in the early 2000s with the development of the Clean Development Mechanism, as well as the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, which represented the primary source of demand for these carbon credits. Volumes increased year by year until starting to drop in 2010, and that coincides with the EU amending the eligibility criteria and eventually actually no longer allowing for these CDM carbon credits to be used within the EU emissions trading scheme. And this came with much consternation from a lot of developing nations, namely India, which were large producers of these CDM credits, which now no longer had a market to go to, unfortunately. And in fact, many of these carbon clean development mechanism credits are still around today and essentially unsellable because they are not valued highly by the market given their age and also the difficulties with interacting with the UN's original registry. It's very difficult to be a participant there, at least to do so in a voluntary sense. So in the early 2010s, the carbon market was in a bit of a carbon winter, if you will, and it was quite a tricky time for developers. But then we saw volumes starting to increase once again, as we saw an increase in the adoption of claims for carbon neutrality and carbon neutral products. And this really coincided with a high point in the pandemic when environmental concerns were front of mind. The market eventually reached a high point of $2 billion in 2021. And this was for a number of reasons, not only because of the pandemic and environment being front of center of mind, but also because CORSIA, the aviation framework, which again I will touch upon in more detail, brought the prospect of significant demand from the international aviation sector, and also the first concept of a standardized framework for carbon credits in the voluntary market. They had a specific set of criteria. And so after that, we saw a number of investors moving into the market, whether it be trading desks, hedge funds, all opening up to get ahead of the expected demand from the aviation sector and to purchase particularly these carbon credits that would be deemed CORSIA eligible, at least at that point under the pilot phase. With the entrance of these more market-savvy participants, whether they be the commodity trading houses and the banks, we saw the exchange platforms launch standardized contracts to service this new liquidity base. And 2021 and 2022 were a really impressive time in terms of market infrastructure development, and liquidity was getting liquidity, and it was a very promising time for the carbon market and this kind of professionalization of the VCM. However, things took a turn for the worse in late 2022. We saw a number of scandals for a number of quite prominent carbon projects for over-issuing credits and other such scandals, which spooked an awful lot of voluntary demand in the market. And then this also coincided with 2023, a decision by the scientific advisory body of the CORSIA program, developing new eligibility criteria for the carbon credits, which in effect meant that all existing standardized contracts and all existing investors in the market holding what were the original eligibilities out of pocket, because suddenly every single carbon credit that was originally deemed eligible was no longer eligible for the next stage of the scheme, which would be the mandatory phase, where we expected all the demand to actually enter the market. So this was really unfortunate, and an awful lot of investors and market participants were burned by this and subsequently pulled out of the market. Seeing it as being too risky, what with the reputational risks in the voluntary market and then the regulatory and political risks with the rather arbitrary seeming nature over decision making over carbon credit eligibilities for compliance schemes. So what is CORSIA and why does it have such an outsized impact on the voluntary carbon market? Well, CORSIA stands for the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It was developed by the ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, to address the emissions from international flights. Now, this is a tricky subject area because there are question marks as to where the responsibility for the emissions lie. Is it with the airline, the country that hosts the airline, the destination, the origin country? There's lots of questions associated with this. And the ICAO wants to create a framework that was international in nature, which every country could participate, create a standard set of rules, and crucially allow every country to contribute to. So again, they moved away from using, say, national ETS schemes, which would then preclude certain nations from participating, And the one market that could solve this for them was the voluntary carbon market. Because of its global nature and its project-specific nature, as soon as the eligibilities were determined by ICAO, in theory, every country could participate and generate carbon credits for the scheme. As part of the scheme, airlines have already been mandated to report on their emissions annually. The CORREGGIO scheme will take 2019 as a baseline year, and it's been determined that 30% below the level of flights in 2019 is the baseline, upon which any airline today that goes above this baseline of say 70% of their flights in 2019, they will now have to surrender carbon offsets to meet in the first mandatory phase of this. And the first mandatory phase, or phase one, is from 2024 to 2026. This isn't for all countries, this is just for those that have volunteered to be participants in this first phase. And then in phase two, from 2027 onwards, we expect to see the rest of all the nations participate, with the exception of some of the least developed and landlocked nations. But we'll see all the major nations participate, including China and India, in that second phase of CORREGGIO. In order to provide some form of financial floor for the pricing of these carbon credits, ICAO came up with a number of eligibility criteria that carbon credits had to meet so that they could thereby reduce the size of the available credits in the market. Because again, as mentioned previously, there's an awful lot of carbon credits that exist out there that are priced below $1, and they're kind of flooded the market. So ICAO had to come up with these eligibility criteria to reduce that pool of availability and thereby create some form of, increase the price and thereby create a form of financial incentive for companies or airlines to reduce their emissions. When this first came out in 2020, we saw a rush of exchanges creating these standardized products. At ACX, for example, their contract started trading at 60 cents at the beginning of the year and then ended at $9.60 at the end of 2021. So it made a tremendous run and really illustrates this increase in market participation when the standardized contract came out. And the market was really moving in a healthy direction until 2023, when ICAO updated the eligibility criteria and no longer permitted the original basket of eligible credits, which were under the pilot phase, which was a purely voluntary scheme whereby airlines could participate, and to be honest, none really did. And the new eligibility criteria that ICAO had in mind, a crucial component was Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which though this made carbon credits themselves much more applicable in terms of their contribution to worldwide emission reduction, the single-handed disqualification of all the existing CORREGGIO credits meant that an awful lot of market participants left the market due to this after being burnt and suffering heavy losses. And another issue faced when they released the new criteria is that actually at that point, and it's still the case today, not many carbon credits are in existence with the Article 6 authorization, because countries haven't quite got into or got to grips with the Article 6 mechanism and determining which credits they're happy to authorize for export and those that they're not. And perhaps this slide best illustrates the Article 6 mechanism in action. As you can see, you have the buying, purchasing countries on the left-hand side and the countries that are supplying the carbon credits on the right-hand side. And you have the years at which the agreements were signed between those two countries. But this is crucially for Article 6.2 of the Paris Accords. Going forward, there will be development of Article 6.4 framework, which will enable carbon credits issued under that to be purchased and traded among any nation through a single centralized UN registry. So everyone's eagerly awaiting that, but that will take time to be developed and rolled out. So in the meantime, the 6.2 framework, which is the bilateral agreements between individual countries, is going to be the mainstay for a lot of the carbon credits being generated in the meantime. But they have much more reduced applicability between nations and the broader market as a whole. So to conclude and provide an overview, I think I'll start with the risks and say downsides facing the market in the future. Particular risks that face, say, CORREGGIO include if the USA, under the current administration, if they were to pull out of the CORSIA framework, we might see a number of other nations follow suit. For example, Argentina has been mentioned in reports and others, and it could even spell the death of it if the likes of, say, China and India also decide to pull out of the agreement. Although, admittedly, because they're in the second phase of the scheme, we have until 2027 for them to make up their mind on this. Secondly, the EU is going to be releasing a report next year, which will be assessing CORSIA and its compatibility with global mitigation and the EU's own emissions and targets. And were the EU to deem CORSIA a failure and not proficient enough at emission reduction, then they could decide to bring international flights coming into and out of Europe under the EU emissions trading scheme, which could also spell the end of the framework as other nation states follow suit within and bring international aviation under their own emissions trading schemes. And the final risk facing CORSIA is its own mechanism itself. For example, the enforcers of the CORSIA framework are the national aviation authorities, and they are expected to fine airlines for not adhering to CORSIA. And if these aviation bodies do not take this role seriously, then airlines may not cooperate with the scheme. Or alternatively, there could be, as we see today, a lack of Article 6 and unauthorized carbon credits in the market, and thus airlines will be unable to meet their CORSIA obligations, at least through the use of carbon credits. And so it could become a simple taxation scheme, depending on the national penalties, the different penalties set at the national level at the aviation authorities. And now to end on a more positive conclusion, carbon credits are evolving rather than collapsing. Again, the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market, has had to weather multiple storms over the years, and it has always managed to survive despite all the hurdles and setbacks that have been thrown at it. And politicians are waking up to the value this market could bring in terms of reducing the costs of mitigation activities and allowing that private sector involvement in the meeting net zero targets and the transition. We've all seen the power that our economic system has to disrupt and destroy the planet, and it speaks to the power of that system inherently. And the beauty of the carbon market and mechanisms like it is that it can leverage these same economic systems to produce environmental goods as opposed to environmental harms. And I hope we can see an equally drastic transition and outcome as we have with the rapid development of economics and society in the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. Naturally, with all this uncertainty surrounding us and surrounding the markets, prices, early movers will be rewarded, those that can secure those carbon credits up front. But that being said, they will be taking on substantial risks, whether or not their carbon credits and their projects will be eligible under these compliance schemes of the future. So they are taking a tremendous risk in investing in these projects, although having a diverse portfolio across a number of jurisdictions as well will aid in abetting these risks. And it's perhaps worth noting that the carbon market needs pragmatism over perfection. While scrutiny is very much warranted, we risk undermining progress by holding climate action to unattainable standards that we don't hold to traditional industry, particularly when the focus is on other, say, co-benefits outside of the fundamental value of the unit of 1 ton of emission removed or avoided. Carbon markets are by no means a silver bullet, yet they have an important role to play. And today, and time is of the essence, and we haven't got the luxury to remove a crucial part of our toolbox or Swiss Army knife for addressing the climate challenge. All tools need to be on the table, and the carbon market is a crucial piece of this decarbonisation toolbox. And on a final note, for those firms that are looking to purchase carbon credits in the future, I'd be a very rich man if I got a dollar for every time that I've spoken to a chief sustainability officer who've mentioned the fact that they will need offsets in the future, but not until 2030 when their net zero targets kick in. Now, unless that firm is under a compliance scheme or they expect to be in the future, they should be purchasing carbon credits now whilst they're relatively inexpensive and building up that portfolio ahead of time, because come 2030, there's going to be an awful lot of corporates rushing to buy these units. And not only that, 2030 isn't a one-off commitment, it's in perpetuity. Every year post 2030, these firms are going to need to start purchasing offsets or continue to purchase offsets. And so getting ahead of the game is perhaps a prudent move. But thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you taking the time.